Before we get started, I did want to reflect. I know a few weeks ago, you'll learn a little bit more about FIU and DC in our Talent Lab programs, but a few weeks ago, we were hosting one of our student seminars, and it was one of our last since this crisis. And it's kind of telling that at that moment, when we realized we were going to be facing this crisis, one of the parting advice that we gave our students was to open your eyes, observe, question, understand, but learn from how our government and our governments at all levels are going to be reacting to this once in a lifetime challenge. Those of us that are of a certain age, even in Florida, remember the impact that a large disaster like Hurricane Andrew could have, and that changes business, changes the psyche, changes policy, etc. for decades. In this case, this is a global challenge, and definitely not just localized to a region. And it's definitely clear that the challenges and these responses that we're seeing are going to define us, for much time. So let's a bit more about us for those of you that are joining and experiencing FIU in DC. FIU in DC is your competitive advantage in the nation's capital. We seek to advance solutions through our people, policy, and partnerships here in DC. Primarily, we advocate and promote our preeminent researchers. Many of those are actually, as we speak, working on COVID-specific work. So we've taken that mantle as well, and making sure that they are connected to a lot of the key agencies that are funding a lot of this work. We definitely ensure that our university is involved and at the table in areas that we have relevance on. And of course, as you'll see today, we support our student success by providing you access to many key players like today, helping you get paid internships throughout the year, etc. We're proud that in the last year, our Talent Lab has hosted over 500 students during 16 fly-in seminars, which we hope many of you would join in the future, as well as help place 100 student interns through the collaboration of many of our academic partners, and I know some of those will be on the call today. Before we wrap up the call today, the webinar, we will give you Eric Feldman, my colleague who's also joining us live today, will give you some sense of some exciting developments both for the summer and this fall. So, but first, down to business. Our goals for today, basically, I think you have a couple of points here. We wanted to give you an insider's view, both from someone that's currently on the Hill, someone that has worked on the Hill and around the Hill, and an expert on those processes, on the mechanics of the process that took place with CARES, touch on some of the key elements and what we expect the intended impacts to be. Looking towards the future, what could we be looking at in the next few weeks? And of course, our audience is filled with eager students and recent grads or soon-to-be grads. You're interested in opportunities. Although the landscape might immediately look a little bit uncertain as far as start dates and opportunities, we don't want to lose sight of that. I will say, if there's anything in particular at this point that you think you'd like us to cover, a goal for yourself for this call, or that you think would be great for the entire group, please comment on chat at this moment, just so we can kind of incorporate that and adapt as well. Lineup and the order, we'll start with some opening remarks from both of our guests, and then I'll get us started on some questions of both of them, but then we'll open the door as soon as possible to questions from you all. We prefer if you can raise your hand via the mechanism on Zoom, or if you'd like, definitely use chat. This is a great opportunity to hear directly from you, and these are two individuals as well that work for organizations that are always looking for great talent. So if you can, feel free to use the opportunity to speak to us live. A bit of CARES Act background that hopefully most of you have heard of, but we've heard a lot of these key takeaways, but one of the largest relief bills in US history, $2.3 trillion. This was not the first COVID-related relief act, and definitely not the last. Just before CARES, we might have studied the Families First Corona Response Act, focused a lot on paid leave, testing, and food assistance. CARES itself, as you'll see on one of these graphs on the screen, produced by one of our partners, addresses an array of programs, direct payments to Americans, expansion of unemployment insurance, billions of dollars to both small and large businesses and key corporations and industry groups, and of course, a new wave of significant funding for the health response. Bit of a side note, commercial from the higher ed community. And I know one of our guests also teaches at local university here in Washington. We were very focused, and we will still be, on future stimulus and this stimulus. In particular, we're pleased that CARES Act does address emergency financial aid grants directly for our students. It does address potential losses, and losses we're already experiencing because of campus operations, additional flexibilities for students on repaying their loans and Pell Grants, etc. So the ballpark here, we do know that about 13.9 billion of the CARES Act will funnel directly to institutions. So that's something we're constantly, and I can always expand on that if anyone's interested there. A bit of news today. We've a couple of 2 or 3 nuggets, two that I wanted to share with you. It was interesting on the impressive side. Yesterday, interview by Congressman Greg Walden of Oregon, who's a ranking member on the Energy Committee. This might interest one of our panelists, and she can probably expand on it, but SBA, he was telling how SBA has transferred more money to small businesses in 3 days than in the entire last year. Just to give you a snapshot of how massive and impressive and rapid the effort aims to be. On the not so good news front, it was announced today that an additional 6 million Americans additionally signed up for unemployment benefits. That brings the total just within this last month to about 16 million. So these are record historic numbers. So let me introduce our special guests. To begin with, we have Eleni Valanos, who serves as a professional staff member at the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Prior to that, she worked directly in the personal office of Florida's own senior senator and regular faculty fellow from time to time at our Green School. Both the senator, of course, and Eleni are very familiar with FIU and have been very helpful to FIU over the years, so we're glad to have Eleni here. She's a graduate of the College of Charleston and currently completing a master's herself at Georgetown. And Sarah Binder is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and a professor of political science at GW, George Washington University. She specializes in Congress and legislative politics. Her own current research focuses on the relationship between Congress and the Federal Reserve, which of course has also been in play in the last month. She's written an award-winning book that I can't wait to read, especially considering we're all geeks for this stuff. Focus on legislative gridlock. Sarah received her bachelor's from Yale, PhD from University of Minnesota, and she herself started her career on the Hill as a legislative aide and press secretary to Representative Lee Hamilton. So we're glad to have you both here. We do want to start off with Eleni Valanos, and she is joining us via phone, Zoom phone. So Eleni, why don't you give us your first impressions as far as your own role in the operation, and also what's happened in your office, and considering your boss does have a key leadership role on the Hill. So thank you, Eleni.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks everyone for having me join the discussion. As Carlos mentioned, I'm currently a professional staff member for Chairman Rubio on the Senate Small Business Committee, and we have jurisdiction over the Small Business Administration. But because small businesses touch every industry and have their hand in everything, it gives us a lot of flexibility with what we can do in terms of oversight and hearings and trying to target what works well for small businesses. And before I begin, I just want to say that I've been with the senator for about 6 years, and some of my best friends I met in the process went to FIU. So I'm really excited to join this discussion, and I've known Carlos, throughout that whole time. So thank you again. I started as in a junior position in the senator's personal office, so where we work directly for the constituents of Florida, and then, like I mentioned, I transitioned into this role on the committee where he's the chairman, so I focus more on specific policy issues, and my focus on the committee is on disaster policy issues. So people don't really know this, but the Small Business Administration is one of the only federal agencies that gives out direct disaster loans to people after natural disasters, or in this case, this new pandemic. And so one of those programs that you may have heard of often that keeps getting thrown around with CARES and other things is called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. So that's one of my main focuses on the committee. And then just kind of generally, Senate staff and congressional staff are all split up to handle in the policy shops to handle specific issues. So I don't know how much you all know about that, and we can maybe get into that later if you have more questions, but there's a dedicated staff to certain issues. So my focus is this SBA disaster space. And previously I worked on different issues related to commerce, fisheries, some environmental and energy issues. But now I'm doing this. I also did some FEMA work, which is kind of why I was right for the disaster portfolio here. And then getting more into what Congress has been doing the last month or so on the coronavirus issue. As you've seen and as Carlos laid out, we've done 3 stimulus bills in relation to COVID-19. And so all these funding measures are attempting to infuse federal resources into agencies to deal with this ever-evolving pandemic turned, I think, economic crisis. So that phase 1 bill that we brought up was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. That was signed into law on March 6th, and that was $8.3 billion in emergency funding. So that was focused on ensuring that vaccines could get developed and be affordable, that there would be more money for the SBA's Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and that Medicare recipients can be able to consult with their providers by telephone, teleconference, and some other things. Phase 2 was the Family First Coronavirus Response Act that was enacted into law on March 18th, and that was $100 billion. And Carlos mentioned this previously, but that was really focused on paid sick leave, coronavirus testing, expanded food assistance like school nutrition programs, additional unemployment benefits, and more protections for employers to provide for their healthcare workers. Phase 3, as we're trying to focus on in today's discussion, was the CARES Act. And again, as Carlos mentioned, the largest stimulus bill in history, $2.2 trillion. It includes a bunch of different things, including direct payments to individuals, huge expansions on unemployment benefits, student loan forgiveness, much more. It also includes what our committee worked on, small business provisions, one of them being the Paycheck Protection Program that attempts to give financial assistance through loans directly to small businesses through banks and through this other SBA program known as the 7A program. So it expands that program for a short period of time and then would allow these businesses to have the opportunity to get those loans forgiven or pretty much paid back for payroll costs, rent, interest on mortgages, leases, and utilities. So we thought that this was a way through the banks instead of through the SBA, like the other program that I mentioned, I work mostly on, we thought that this would be the best way to get money into the hands of folks. And then turning to kind of what negotiations were like, and why the Senate kind of took the lead on this phase 3 bill as opposed to the House. There's really no rhyme or reason why the Senate took the pen on this bill. It's kind of the way everything ended up playing out. It almost seems like a ping pong game between the two chambers. There's not necessarily always a process that needs to be followed there, but I think in this case, there were a lot of senators, including Chairman Rubio, that had already been negotiating with leadership and the White House on a lot of these issues. So since they were already taking the lead on this, we thought we'd run with it. And then just for kind of background insider scoop, we knew that we were going to be doing these types of bills as early as February, and we had been kind of working on what our priorities were going to be there, especially, I'm speaking for the small business side. So even though those two first bills didn't do that much in terms of small business changes, we were already kind of working on what those could be, massaging through those issues. And in terms of negotiations, it may seem to the public, and I don't know, maybe I can hear from you all and what you thought, but that the CARES Act was done quickly, airdropped, but in reality, we were working on this and negotiating for quite a while. And I think there may have been some reports of this in the news, but so I can explain it better, Leader McConnell definitely recognized that this would be a huge task and that we would need to get it together rather quickly. So he assembled senators into bipartisan groups, each focused on various tasks. And so they could work on different sections of the bills on their assigned topics instead of, having 100 senators wanting their own thing. So there was one task force on small business liquidity, which is what Chairman Rubio took the lead on. And we worked with our committee ranking member Cardin, Senator Collins, Shaheen, and others on those provisions specifically. So like I said, it's a little easier to work on a bill in this segmented fashion so you can put something together quickly. And then it's just easier to get it across the finish line, especially when you have everyone working on it in a bipartisan manner before you release it to the public. So we kind of kept a close hold on that text before it was released so we could maintain the integrity of the negotiation process and, inputting stakeholder feedback and whatnot. And then afterwards, of course, Speaker Pelosi came to the table with some other wants and needs, and both chambers were able to work through those and put together a finished product. So that's kind of generally how the negotiations played out, and I look forward to hearing some of your other questions. I may have rambled on a little too long, but
no, that's
look
great.
forward to questions
yeah, I'm sure we'll follow up with some specific questions on those inner workings. All
right.
So Sarah, you yourself have been watching Congress for a good amount of time. And you've also, as we've pointed out, written about congressional gridlock. Some might say that what we've just witnessed was the antithesis to gridlock because of the quick pace. But curious from your perspective, what we've just witnessed over the last month and the action and collaboration between chambers and even between parties. Why don't you give us your perspective?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for including me. It's a special pleasure to be on with Eleni to give us some on-the-ground sense of what exactly was going on behind the scenes that those of us outside the institution sometimes struggle to kind of really understand precisely the dynamics that are going on the ground, so to say. And I would just say congressional staff don't get nearly the degree of appreciation that they deserve, especially in crisis times. So I think, Carlos, you put your finger on a key issue for those of us who study Congress from outside the institution, which is that in what we think of today as kind of normal times, the word of the day is legislative stalemate or gridlock, just the difficulty that the two parties and the two chambers, and the two branches have solving what appear to be public problems. And lots of reasons we can come back to, and of course, sometimes the parties don't agree on whether something is a problem. But we often say that it takes crisis to get members to focus, to get lawmakers to come to the table. And we have lots of examples historically of that, whether it's World War II, Great Depression, whether it's the reaction to 9/11 or the global financial crisis just over a decade ago. So we often say crisis compels action. I would encourage us to maybe unpack that a little, because there's nothing, think of it this way, crisis might be necessary, but it's not always sufficient to get Congress to address key issues, and certainly not in the seemingly comprehensive way that they did in the CARES Act and the two earlier versions last month. I think it's important to keep in mind that when a crisis occurs, lawmakers don't just drop their pre-existing commitments, their ideological views, their policy stances, their electoral commitments. But I think what happens here, and we see this over and over when periods of these intensity of a crisis occurs, is there is immense pressure on members and parties not to be blamed for inaction. And that holding out too long for a particular stance or a particular program, or refusing to negotiate in the first place, that risks being blamed for an even worse outcome, right? By failing to act, that Congress makes the country worse off. And so whenever a big package comes together like this, you will hear leaders, whether it was the minority leader in the Senate, Schumer, or the majority leader, McConnell, will say something like, the American people expect us to act, and so we acted. I think it's a little more political than that, as both sides understand with mounting deaths and millions unemployed and no real end in sight, that blocking action is just off the table as a political strategy, even though it's like the currency of getting your way on many other issues over time. But for this degree of crisis, failure to act, the consequences, it would be very clear who to blame, and neither party wants the blame here. So first, I guess the first observation is clearly these are not normal times, and yet the dynamic we see that compels action, it's not all that different than what we see in less crisis-prone times. We can see that, I guess, in a second set of observations about what the process was like, at least viewed from the 30,000-foot view level, and what it had in common with sort of the dynamics of Congress today. And I'd offer three characteristics of the CARES Act here and the dynamics of that process. First, it was extraordinarily leadership-driven, although that is really the norm, right? At least for the last 2+ decades, that a much stronger willingness on the part of rank and file members to, in essence, allow leaders to take the stands in negotiations, particularly with the White House and with other party leaders. So in that sense, rank and file deference to leaders is not new, but we certainly came to the fore here, right? Phase 2 was a Secretary Mnuchin really mostly negotiating, at least the first with Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, then the second one, the third, Phase 3, being much more Senate focused, as Elena mentioned here. So the exception here probably is Elena's point on phase 3, where McConnell essentially deputized bipartisan groups based on their committee assignments in the Senate to generate many of these ideas that most, but not all of which came into fruition into the larger package. But by and large, this is a very leadership-driven Congress, but it has been in recent years. Second characteristic, this is what we often call legislating in the dark, and literally it was this time. Many of these agreements, the shuffling back and forth of the Secretary-Treasurer between Schumer and McConnell and Pelosi, occurring at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight, and so forth. And that's clearly a function of the severe time constraint to get something done quite quickly. But of course, this legislating in the dark enhances the power of leaders as well, because most rank and file members don't have a full appreciation of the details in the package, right? In part because it's happening so quickly, which of course enhances more leadership power to say, we really have to act. And we saw a little episode in the House where one of the House Republicans did not want this thing to pass without a recorded roll call vote. And we can come back to the dynamics of it, but it was a quite unusual event, combining the need for social distancing with getting something done without a roll call vote, entailing House members going into the gallery to take places so that they wouldn't be near to their colleagues. But by and large, that's the exception that proves the rule of a very leadership-driven process with few details really for rank and file. And just finally, the third element here that's not that unusual for today's Congress is just a radical, really, delegation to the administration, whether it's the Small Business Administration, whether it's to the Secretary-Treasury Mnuchin, who ends up with an awful lot of power in his hands in this process. A lot of delegation here to the executive branch to implement. Now, in the one way we should like that, right? Micromanaging by Congress in an emergency is probably not a great idea. However, the flip side of that is concerns that were raised during the negotiations here about what type of accountability processes are put into place, what type of oversight mechanisms are put into place, so that elected officials have some eyes and ears to understand whether corrections need to be made, more money, less money, more conditions, and so forth. But that's not a new problem for Congress, and I think the degrees of polarization, partisanship combined with the emergency context here really dictated a massive flow of really authority to the executive branch. So just as we can come back to these, just moving ahead, there are more challenges here for Congress, certainly oversight, which we can come back to, phase 4, right, which we saw a little obstacle on the Senate floor today. And then we should come back, I think, maybe to this question of remote voting for the House and Senate. Like, how are these two chambers going to operate in the next month or two, let alone should there unfortunately be a return of this particular virus in a second wave. Neither the House or Senate are procedurally or parliamentary in place, designed. They don't have a mechanism yet to vote remotely, and there's a lot of disagreements in the two chambers and amongst the leaders about whether it's time to start planning, but we can come back to some of those as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for setting up. I did want to pitch back to Eleni. Eleni, your own expertise with disasters. It's funny, we typically, in advocating for FIU, we sometimes say, you know, that's our expertise, considering we do hurricanes, we do storm surges, and a lot of our research focuses on disasters. I'm curious, from a policy perspective, the disaster loans, the EIDLs, from previous episodes and disasters to what we're dealing with now, were there any nuances or any differences to that program? And I believe that's about $10 billion just for those loans that you can speak to, that because of the times we're living in, this individual crisis, that were different or distinct?
Sure. So in the CARES Act, we tried to expanded that, we call it the EIDL program, for a period of time. So that would have been retroactively from January 31st till the end of this year, to expand certain eligibility so more businesses could get those loans. One thing, though, that I had found concerns with in talking to folks that had gotten EIDLs in the past from hurricanes and whatnot was that the SBA only, out of their whole disaster loan portfolio, which includes physical disaster loans for businesses and homes, and then property damage, that the EIDLs only accounted for about 2% of all the disaster loans that they had done. So we initially, as a committee, had some concerns with using that program as a conduit to getting money out to small businesses in this disaster situation. We'd also heard complaints about the program in general, not getting funding quick enough from that, or having loan officers not truly understand what economic damage was. So that's sort of why we went through the route of this Paycheck Protection Program through another SBA loan program that would be directly through the banks. But yeah, we're finding that, and with the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, and the EIDL program, I guess there was so much outreach on it, there's so much appetite for it, that we need more funding for those programs. So that's going to
Paycheck
be
Protection, I'm sorry, Peyton. That was a first time ever, right? This is a new program altogether?
Yeah, so that is the SBA 7A loan program, and sorry to get too in the weeds, but if you all want more information on what that program looks like and how we expanded it, it's a expansion of a current program that gets money to people through banks. But yes, we are finding that even with this expansion of the EIDL program, that there's such a high demand that this is something that we definitely will need to increase funding for later. So that's something that we tried to do today in the Senate. We tried to increase funding for the PPP program, but that failed because some of the Democrats objected, as they wanted some more funding for other things put in. And so I think that's more of like a phase 4 bill. So we'll see what happens next week, but we definitely need these programs plussed up.
Okay. And yeah, we'll continue on with Sarah, from in the broadest sense, be it politically or economically, your reactions, what are the main calculations that you think Congress as a whole was making with CARES Act? What's their calculus in this $2.2 trillion measure?
So I think in contrast to the last episode of crisis legislating in terms of the global financial crisis, which spelled out a little more slowly with some peak points in late 2008, the focus there, both on what we call TARP, or the Wall Street bailout, but also the economic stimulus bill, which was about $700–800 billion, which was landmark, right, at the time in early 2009. The focus there, the framing, the mentality, everything was about stimulus, about how are you going to spark the economy to revive itself, and how are you going to get the financial system itself, how do you liquidate it? How do you get money and credit flowing back through the financial plumbing? But that's entirely different than the onus here and the burden here on Congress, which is really, it's relief. It's emergency, and it's emergency relief, right? We would have to really go back to something like the Great Depression to have that level of focus on how are we going to help out people who have been put in a circumstance not of their fault at all, but who've lost jobs, unable to keep their businesses open, unable to get loans to pay people and so forth, who are found suddenly out of work, whether it's universities or small businesses, right? A whole range of across the economic spectrum and across economic of levels here. So that framing relief, I think it changed the nature of the type of tools that Congress used here. First of all, the cash payments to individuals, right? We've had that in different forms, But what's remarkable here is it was just really almost a small part of this broader $2.2 billion package. And for all the attention to sort of trying to get the SBA loan program to banks and out to small businesses up and running, there's a whole other issue about how Treasury and how, why, and when they're going to be able to get checks pushed out to individuals, get these cash payments moving. So the relief framing here changed the nature of the types of activities here for sure. I would say also there is always an electoral dynamic. If not, it's not to say that's their only goal, absolutely not. But the electoral horizons, their electoral view, it colors everything that lawmakers do, because their re-elections depend, at least historically, in our models of how elections pan out at congressional levels and presidential levels, right? The state of the economy has very clear ramifications for lawmakers' own electoral careers. Yeah. And so that's clearly coloring members' willingness to come to the table, and to come to the table quickly and to agree to things that they might not otherwise agree to, okay, for sure.
Yeah. And do you expect that future phases will be just as quick?
Well, I think what we've learned from past crises is that the farther you get away from a crisis, the more these standing commitments and ideological views and policy commitments come to the fore. But we are still in this crisis, and so I think phase 4 will be harder. We get a little flavor of that today, but there are clear needs out there, which I think will still probably lead to a phase 4, but it won't be nearly as lickety-split, I don't think, as phase 3.
Okay. We have a question from Nicholas Foglia. Nicholas, I believe you've been unmuted.
Oh, thank you so much, Carlos. My question is actually for Ms. Binder. Now you sort of touched upon it a little bit just now, this idea that obviously there's elections, the election coming up, and so there's some form of influence to get something done. And sort of Carlos just asked about it, but I wonder if you sort of go on a little bit more about it. How do you think going forward, this is going to affect the elections to some extent? And going forward, how do you think that, are we going to see representatives and senators sort of start to address more proactively certain issues that are coming up? Or is it just going to be, these stimulus bills and hope for the best, and then hopefully everything goes back to normal by before the election start? How do you see that process going forward?
That's a great question. And I think there's a fair amount of uncertainty here, because there are a series of uncertainties that all affect each other. Right? First, the virus, and the course of the virus, is going to affect what the economic recovery looks like, in both the timing of it and what we think of as the shape of it. Or economists call this, is it a V, right? We spring right back up. Is it, now they call it a Nike swoosh, right? Is it long and gradual? And of course, no matter how hard the Federal Reserve works to push credit out to businesses and in a broad array of borrowers, far broader than they're used to supporting, they themselves will say it depends on the course of the virus. And of course, the course of the virus also depends on how we and how government decide what type of directives to give us, to how long to social distance, how to social distance. What do you do when it seems like the virus is diminishing? How do you prevent a second recurrence? So all of those uncertainties, if we could answer those, we'd have a better able to answer your question. I think some issue here is, what does the recovery look like in the fall? What does campaigning look like in the fall if we're still social distancing in some form? I would say, just generally, we have two different ways of explaining what's likely to happen to a party's fortunes, and they're a little bit of at odds with each other. Traditionally, we think the state of the economy really drives much of what we see in terms of election outcomes, the fate for incumbents and the fate for the governing party. Of course, we're in a period of split control, so hard to tell. But the other model says that people are very committed to their parties and to their partisanship. And so they see the world through Democratic blinders and Republican blinders. And so some will think that President Trump did an excellent job, and those who disapproved of him before the crisis will think he did a rotten job. And so somewhere between the two of those, we'll see which is really stronger, right? My own economic situation, does that color my views of the world and my vote? or really my partisan commitments? Is that how I see the world? And this will be a big test case once again for how those play out.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Gabriella Lasso, thank you, Nicholas, asked the question here, and I'll go to the future forward part of her question. What are some, based on what we've already in 2 weeks kind of in kicking the tires on what we expect to be the impact, what are some policy recommendations you would give to better the CARES Act? So Eleni, I guess I would frame that in, besides more money for the paycheck protection, which was attempted today, any other, as much as you can reveal publicly, or other points where from a small business perspective, improvements that might be attempted in future rounds?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question and something that we're taking into account as we think about a phase 4 bill. Like I mentioned, and like you said, I think funding will be number one, making sure that these programs have enough funding to meet the appetite and the needs of the small businesses that need to get this funding. And then we're also looking at how do we change it, and how do we work with Treasury and SBA on some further guidance for the program, because there were certain parts of the bill where we left it very broad, and Treasury and SBA came up with something that we thought was a little different than what our congressional intent was going to be. One of the things that I've been working on with this EIDL program is how those EIDL and PPP interact together. We want to make sure that folks could take out both types of loans as long as they're not meant for the same purposes. But that has been a struggle with this rollout so far, because there isn't a clear message from the agencies in terms of how you can do that. So it'll be a lot of, without saying too much, there's going to be a lot of work with us clarifying our congressional intent and then working with the executive branch in implementing it.
Okay. And Sarah, any, be it specific policy recommendations? I mean, you're currently focusing on the Fed. Does that get addressed in future rounds, or just even from a process? Are there any improvements that you would like to see for how Congress acts for future acts?
So I guess I'll just add on the Federal Reserve, the CARES Act had a somewhat I would call it somewhat unusual, meaning it's different than the nature of the Fed programs they undertook to some degree in 2007, 2008 during the financial crisis. In the wake of the financial crisis, Congress wrote this Dodd-Frank Act to restructure the financial system. And one of the things they did was to change the way the Fed would run its future emergency lending programs. And they added two things that we're seeing happen right now. And I think a lot of people are kind of focused on how this is really going to work and whether it needs some more direction from Congress or not. One thing is now the Fed now needs the Treasury Secretary to sign off on its lending facilities, which for its first, let's say they had those powers for about 70, 80 years. These were all Fed programs. Now Treasury Secretary has to weigh in on them, which I think from the Fed's perspective, varying views, but it does give them some broader political basis to these lending programs, which are quite important. But the second thing Congress did in the wake of the financial crisis was to add a line to the Fed's power saying taxpayer can't really lose money, right, on these lending programs. And in the financial crisis, the Fed did not, quote unquote, lose money. But what you see now in the CARES Act is this provision where Fed and Treasury, in essence, have, some both joint control or influence over the nature of these lending programs, in that Treasury provides a backstop, provides billions of dollars to essentially seed and to cover losses on these lending programs. So why is this important? Right? We think of the Fed as this sort of neutral, technical, nonpartisan entity that looks at the financial world and decides where the issues are. But now the Treasury is involved. It's moving into a little bit of fiscal policy. It's not just its own narrow monetary policy. So there'll be questions here. Should the Fed be subject to the types of restrictions that are placed on some of the CARES money about no buybacks, about no pay raises for corporate elites and so forth? So there'll be questions here. The bigger the role for the Fed, lawmakers might want, and you hear a little bit of grumbling now about whether or not these other programs run by the Fed should be subject to these limitations that Congress has tried to place onto these Treasury-funded programs.
Mm-hmm. And I know it's a totally different extension, but only because we've followed Chairman Rubio, Eleni, and we know that, especially in the last year, his role as chair, he's been driving the SBA, to modernize itself, to enter the digital era. It's, it hasn't been a rubber stamp by any stretch of the imagination. I'm curious, this gets more into the congressional oversight. What role will the committee play in measuring the effectiveness of these dollars and how the administration, had carried it out? How does the senator and the team see your role in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've already started talking about that. I think at the beginning of the year, we sort of come up with our plan for what sort of hearings we want to do, what type of events, what we need the senator to be at. And that totally changed with this crisis that came into hand. So what I think we're definitely would want to focus on, and I don't know when these would be scheduled now with the social distancing and when that ends, but it's definitely some sort of oversight hearings over periods of time. That's something that we had talked about, a few months into it, 6 months into it, a year into it, to see, how everything's worked. And then I'll also point out that Congress has GAO and CBO, which are some of the strongest tools that we have to conduct oversight. So CBO is really great at looking at the overarching economic impacts of this. And then GAO is the Government Accountability Office, is able to come in and backwards and forwards do an extremely thorough investigation into our work, and they provide a neutral position on things, and they come out with reports. And then, as Congress, we can take their insights and their reports and use them to further make policy decisions and changes in the future. And then obviously there's inspector generals per agency, but a lot of those depend on how good they are per agency. I don't know if the SBA one is as good as, let's say, the Department of Defense, but we have all these tools at our disposal as well, so we'll be definitely tracking things.
Okay. And I know you probably have some vantage point on the oversight question, but we do have Derek Boyd, who I know has been waiting to ask a question. Derek?
Well, first, thank you both for the insight on the CARES Act. My question was really if either of you had any insight on like the upcoming, like healthcare stimulus bill, and what do you think that will look like? Is this just relief at, like an healthcare organization level? Will there be any like dwindle down to like, health professionals, like sort of how we have like that individual stimulus, or if you can talk about any other insight on what that looks like.
Sarah, I guess, what have we been hearing when it comes to healthcare in future stimuluses?
Well, there's, I would say we've seen a progression from both parties. We've seen from Pelosi starting big and grand on infrastructure that seemed divorced from the health crisis, right? And then her sort of coming back and finally coming back to a position, at least yesterday and today, saying, let's get focused on doubling essentially monies in the CARES Act beyond just the SBA program. Right? She's gone from big and wide to reinforcing the type of money that's in the original CARES Act, whether it's for hospitals, for state and local governments, which also has ramifications for healthcare. So from her perspective, I think my read of the Democrats here is their big wish list in the sky is not politically tenable, and they're trying to find the sweet spot where they can broaden the horizons here and take advantage of the fact that there might not be a phase 5, but to get everything they can in phase 4. I think from the Republican perspective, from how I read where McConnell has moved, it has been really from now's not the time to do a phase 4. Let's see how programs are working, till today's move, which is lickety split. Let's double the money for a program that we know seems to be working, the SBA. So between the two of those, phase 4 is what can come of that. They're not really on the same page yet. I think I would put it that way. How these deals come together, they're, at least in terms of the CARES Act, it was what I think of these models as win-win. Both parties got their most preferred outcome, and they gave a little on the other side of what wouldn't have been their priority, but they went ahead and swallowed it so that they could get the bigger things. So we don't need bipartisan agreement on every single provision. Right? But we need enough buy-in from both sides to get to a final bill. What phase 4 looks like, Eleni is probably much better situated to know, like where is that bill actually going and at what speed.
Okay, and on that note, we are going to have to trim down the conversation now. But Eleni, what do the next few weeks look like? When is the Senate slated to return as of today? Sarah's already mentioned what is being discussed when it comes to, and you've mentioned already, you've touched on it, what do hearings look like? When do those return to normalcy? Congress was already in the midst of appropriations season. You know, we're waiting to see what markups look like on bills, but you can't have a markup if you don't have a committee meeting. So what do the next few weeks look like, Eleni?
Sure. Another great question. It's difficult to say. We were slated to come back on April 20th, at least in the Senate. But I think first step is to try to see if we can do something like we tried to do today, infusing more money into certain programs, kind of negotiate over the weekend if need be to see if there's anything else we can get in there. But as Sarah has mentioned, all of this is difficult to do when we are also trying to social distance. So in terms of having members come back or staff come back, especially for votes, it's going to be difficult. I know at this point, in terms of our committee, we're sort of intaking information.
You're pulling away there.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. We are intaking information from stakeholders and others on what some priorities would be moving forward, but there's nothing really set in stone. I think a lot of the funding that we have put in the bill, and also as Sarah mentioned, like a lot of this hasn't even flowed down to the states and communities yet. Even some of the small businesses, a lot of money has gone out, but not totally. So we do want to sort of see how things are working before we really jump into something else. But it will definitely be an interesting time. And then in DC, they have put in place stay-at-home orders until the middle of June. So I don't know if that's how that's going to change our April 20th comeback date. I think we're all exempt from that, but at the same time, it's, do we want to be responsible on the health side? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty at this point.
Okay, but and we're gonna, I guess, segueing into the career advice portion. Eleni, I'm just curious. I haven't gotten a full. What does it look like today to work virtually in one of our members of Congress's office, when typically so much of that lifeblood is visitors? And what is the operation, and what has it been like for you in the last month?
Yeah, so it's been a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails, which are very typical, but the Senate, we have a really great, robust system that can handle telework. So I think a lot of us are pleasantly surprised that we can still do most of our jobs in terms of teleworking. All of our staff has official laptops and cell phones, and we're definitely finding it doable. Of course, like we're all facing right now, you don't have those in-person interactions or meetings, so that kind of human interaction is obviously lacking. We have staff calls every day, so we're all on the same page. You can call people, try to figure out what's going on, but it's definitely, there's certain parts that are challenging, but we make it work. I know that some of the meetings that the senator would have to do have become Skype meetings or phone calls, so it's a very different time. I prefer the in-person going to work and talking with people directly, but we're seeing that it's doable.
Okay. Well, actually, Sarah, before I did not want the webinar to end without you historically touching on, for some of our audience that might be wondering, what is four corners besides some version of box ball that we might have played in elementary school?
So I have to say, it's not a term I use, but I see
Okay.
it. I see it used about referencing the majority leader of the Speaker of the House, the minority leader of the House, the majority leader, and the minority leader of the Senate. Those would be the four corners of the four parties. And just to think about it, you might wonder, like, why not two corners? Like, why not a Democratic head and a Republican head? It's just a reminder we have a bicameral system, and just because there's a Democratic caucus in the House and Senate and a Republican conference in the House and Senate doesn't mean that they are on the same page, right? Their members are different, their electoral horizons are their interests are different, even though they share a party label. And so I think that's the significance here of the four corners. Although in reality, you got to let the administration in the door, so
Yeah.
we should probably have a fifth.
And what we saw on the Senate side of Eleni was more McConnell, quickly assembling a bipartisan subgroup. I believe you mentioned the senator was on a small business liquidation type group, and that was distinct from this four corners type operation. So I did want to ask you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, with the four corners lingo, we also use that on the committee level to talk about like a four corners committee agreement. So that would be the Senate Small Business Committee majority and minority, and then the House Small Business Committee majority and minority. So we had a few different versions of some of these bills that we put out, and one of them was nicknamed the Four Corners Bill. So I don't know, just something not formal, but how we kind of refer to ourselves as well.
Cool. I'm curious from both of you. You both, I know, are actively engaged with students. Lenny, I've seen you in action, meeting with many of our student groups and student leaders, and helping mentor many over the years. Curious, and Sarah, you've both worked on the Hill and also the think tank. Our audience are eager, driven students and soon to graduate. Quick advice, 30 seconds or less. What would you give them as far as really breaking into the Washington, D.C. bubble and jobs like yours?
Just quickly, come to Washington any way you can, if that's your goal for a place to work. I know I came to Washington several decades ago and took an internship that turned into a job. Just getting your quote unquote your foot in the door makes a difference for sure. And I would say at Brookings we've moved to a model of paid internships to broaden and diversify the types of students who can afford to come to Washington. And I'd encourage you to either get in touch with me or look on our website where we advertise the internships. And I would just say for the short term, these are going to be virtual internships, paid, but virtual, because we can't, even when we go back into the building, hopefully this summer or fall, it's not clear that we'll have outsiders yet in the building. But Our goal is to diversify Brookings, so it doesn't look like a bunch of white men as it did decades ago. So that's all up to you to come to Washington to help us out to do that.
Okay. And Eleni, yourself, I know your team is hosting currently a virtual FIU intern, so that's kind of cool. But tips and advice for students that may want to break onto the Hill or Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree totally with Sarah. It's all about being here. I think that's at least how I got my job. I'm actually from Washington, D.C., and thought I never wanted anything to do with politics or any sort of work like that, but had the opportunity to intern. And after my first day, knew that it was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, pretty much. So I think the best advice would be to come up here. You can contact me, so you already have one connection. It's all about, unfortunately, sometimes who you know and kind of getting in the door. So you have those connections with us. But it definitely, you need to go and experience. You might think you want to do something, or you might think you may not want to do something, but unless you give it a try, you won't really know. So please, I hope Carlos will share my contact information. I'm happy to talk to anyone for as long as you'd like about this, because I don't know how else to give advice in 30 seconds. But,
yeah, that was good. And final quick 1-2 words, the future, these future phases, the year ahead congressionally, what do you both, if you're to help steer our thinking or what we should be looking for, any top of mind thoughts? Sarah?
I think it'll be a while before we get back to what we used to call normal. I think it's going to look quite a bit different for a while, but at the same time, we shouldn't think that everything has changed. I think there's some enduring characteristics that we see in Congress even through this extraordinary times, and much of those are going to stay the same so long as the sort of broader political and constitutional context in which we work remains on the books.
Okay. And Eleni?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think the first word that came to mind for me was there's uncertainty, but just kind of taking it day by day and trying to be as normal as possible and kind of get everything back up. But I can't imagine that even if these stay-at-home orders finish and shops start opening up again, that it all, we can snap our fingers and it goes back to how it was. I think there's going to be a lot of lag time. So I think everyone's going to need to practice a lot of patience and just kind of work through this new normal.
Yep. And Eleni, I want to thank you and the senator, of course, and the whole team. Obviously, you've always been supportive of FIU, as all of our senators are supportive of their home state institutions. You're going to have a busy year ahead. In particular, though, the senator, for those that are listening, was definitely one of those congressional champions when it came to the higher ed piece of CARES Act. That formula that's being used to divvy up those funds to provide direct support to students, emergency grants, and also institutions. It was weighted very heavily. 75% of that formula is weighted heavily on percentage of Pell Grant students. And for institutions like FIU that are urban, public, minority serving in most cases, that's very important. 50% of our students are Pell Grant recipients, and 50% receive the greatest grant. So I know that he was very much engaged in that dialogue, and we want to thank him. And 50% of whatever FIU does receive from CARES Act will, by law, directly go to students. And Sarah, just the same, we know the role of think tanks and experts from the outside engaging with the key players. So you're also going to have a very busy year. So we thank you both.
Thanks for including me.
No, definitely. Before we wrap up, I want to pitch it to our team member, Eric Feldman, who most of you know, but Eric has a few quick announcements on the next few months for us too.
And I want to start by thanking someone who's in the chat, thanking us, Ashley Ruttenberg, who not only helped us connect to Sarah, because Ashley is one of a little over 3,000 FIU alumni in the DC area and is at the Brookings Institution. And that is an example of how how key our own alumni and students in the area are. But that's also a story of, speaking of getting to DC, I think Sarah's advice was to get to DC. Ashley was on one of the fly-in seminars that we've done over the past year, where she got her own 3-day experience in DC before being up here now. And so our fly-ins, which eventually will resume as a physical concept, are a great way to get to DC and get feet wet. But we also will be announcing early next week. It's what I'm working on as soon as we end this call, a virtual fly-in for early next month, where the kind of same 3-day experience with a common theme would have a variety of events like this one tied together and a little more expensive. So if you're a student getting our emails or follow me on LinkedIn, however you heard about this, you'll hear about that there as well. And as far as getting to DC in a more substantive sense as well, we are very excited at FIU in DC that we are launching for the very first time this fall our Hamilton Scholars Program. This is a well-packaged and comprehensive support program for 15 of the most ambitious and DC prepared students, where a combination of a paid internship, scholarship, an in-person class, and more are available to students who get selected to this program. We've put together a great website at hamilton.fiu.edu, which could answer any question you have about that. My email address is on that site and on the Zoom confirmation link that you got to log in today. So consider me not only accessible, but wanting to hear from you if you're not a current undergrad interested in this program, or anyone, undergrad, grad, alumni, needing to connect to FIU and DC for any learning and career ambitions.
And quick word, Eric, a lot of our students have been asking about summer internships. You want to just give our quick summation of the university's thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So the policy at the university for summer internships is to pursue virtual internships for the summer semester or in-person internships for what we hope would be, again, in the fall semester and beyond, and not to relocate from your current city of living for an internship experience. The team at FIU in DC is in rapid response mode to develop and curate as many virtual internship opportunities as possible through our partners. So Ashley and Sarah will be getting an email from me after this to see if any of those are still available for this current summer, for example. So that's another thing that for any student interested in this opportunity, and especially students who were working towards a summer opportunity already that's no longer available due to the situation, we're going to do our best to have as many virtual interns and to support the virtual internships through scholarships as needed. So we're here for that as well, and we're developing that today and over the coming few days. But we are not wanting to see you here in person quite yet in the near future.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thanks for all the work that you do. Eric's really given a lot of new life to our Washington program, and we're excited. I see many of you logged on here that have participated in our fly-ins. We do hope to see you in person at some point as soon as possible. And thank you to Sarah, thank you to Eleni. You've given us both good perspective on this historic act, and I think we will all be watching at the future phases, most likely virtually in the next few weeks and beyond. So we appreciate, on behalf of FIU, for you joining us today. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.